Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
Can we get serious now?
One thing that did happen during the 60s was some music of an unusual or experimental nature did get recorded and did get released. Now look at who the executives were in those companies at those times. Not hip young guys. These were cigar-chomping old guys who looked at the product that came and said, I don't know. Who knows what it is? Record it, stick it out. If it sells, all right. We were better off with those guys than we are now with the supposedly hip young executives who are making the decisions of what people should see and hear in the marketplace.
Success in the music business begins with a dream, a vision. This podcast will give you, the listener, the insight and tools to turn that vision into a reality. Meet the industry professionals who work day by day behind the scenes, helping to make those dreams come true. Welcome to the business side of music.
In the studio today here in Nashville, Tennessee, Kyle Cantrell. Now, this gentleman's voice, if you listen to the Grand Ole Opry in the past, if you have listened to Bluegrass Junction on Sirius XM, if you have listened to WSM over the years, you're going to recognize this voice. Kyle Cantrell can hardly remember a time when he didn't want to be in radio. As a young boy, he became fascinated with the sound of the voices and music coming out of his grandmother's tube-filled radio. What a great visual that is. The sounds of Noontime Neighbors and the Grand Ole Opry from WSM in Nashville and Paul Harvey's distinctive voice over WSIX were some of his earliest radio memories. You know, I'm a huge Paul Harvey fan.
Oh, I always was myself.
Yeah, grew up listening to him. Kyle was born in Nashville, Tennessee, or more precisely, the suburb of Madison, about 15, 20 minutes from here. The fact that he was born so close to the area where he would live and work all of his life makes him something of a rarity in the broadcasting business. But then you might say that everything about his life makes him a rarity. I would have to agree.
Strange, really. So,
Kyle, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Bob. It is great to be here.
You have led a very full life in the music business, and especially in radio. You know, we talk about all facets of the music industry on the podcast, but I think that you brought up some really nice, I call them bullet points, talking points, about the music business and especially radio. Obviously, when you first got into it, radio was a whole lot different than it is now.
Man, was it ever. It was so different. I tell people that when I started in radio, this was in 1980, and I was 18 years old at that time. When I started in radio, it was all phonograph records and tape machines. And we thought that was pretty advanced because, you know, we were just a few generations removed from disc recording and that sort of thing being the norm. You know, we had as advanced equipment as was available in the technology of radio in those days, but AM was still the dominant medium,
right?
In radio, all the big stations were the AM stations. FM was just getting a toehold. Satellite radio was years away, although we were starting to receive network programming via satellite. But, you know, when I started at WSM, we were still getting NBC via a phone line from someplace that was equalized, and it sounded better than, you know, over the phone. Viewers and listeners can understand that. But they'd been an affiliate of NBC since 1927 and had received the signal from the network the same way for all of those years. So technology now, you know, all of that stuff to a person in radio now is just completely foreign. And I used to marvel at some of the younger guys that came in that didn't even know how to do a live show.
Wow.
Because everything's recorded. And if you didn't do a good job on something, you could just start over. Well, everything was live when I started. You know, if you were on the air for 4 hours, you sat there for 4 hours through every record, every commercial, and you had to dream up things to say between and all of that. So it's changed a whole lot.
I know that at some point in my younger days, local AM radio was more than just playing records. They also did the local news and the farm reports and the weather. And we've become so genre specific now that we've almost kind of lost that hometown touch. Do you agree?
Oh, I miss that too. I that was one of the aspects of radio I loved. You know, when I was a kid and would envision myself in a radio career, which is something I seemed to do from a very young age, I didn't envision myself doing one thing. I wanted to be the guy that did everything. I wanted to be the guy that would, you know, sometimes just be behind the controls and not saying anything. And I wanted to be the guy who would be doing commercials and who would be reading the news and all of those different things. And then the guy who would share music that he loved with listeners as a disc jockey. I envisioned myself doing all of those things because I as a child, and this really sounds strange, Bob, and not to over-spiritualize this, but I believe it was something that God put in me because there is no other explanation. Either that or I'm just mentally deranged. But I had a love for the medium of radio from a very early age, and I cannot tell you why. It was just something that was just in me, and I would, I would always say later that I felt like I was born too late because I'd missed out on the days before television when radio was all there was, and when people really relied on it much more, and when it was a big time kind of thing. When I started, it was, oh, you're in radio? Have you ever thought about getting in television? And I would say, no, I don't want to be in television. I want to be in radio.
Radio as it's transitioned through the years. And of course, you know, I grew up in rock and roll more than in country. And I remember FM radio really, as you said, kind of got a toehold, a foothold in the door. And you started having things like album-oriented rock.
Yes.
Where you would literally play the long sides of an album. You know, the song could be 6, 7, 8 minutes long.
We used to call those the FM versions.
The FM versions. Nice. But in AM radio, and especially in country radio, you didn't get that opportunity, did you? You really had to play the 45 that was handed to you.
You did, because you would notice that things had to move quickly because, again, AM being the more successful medium, we carried a lot more commercials and had a lot more things to do. We did have the weather reports and the news and all of those public affairs kinds of things. We had a heavier commercial load, so there wasn't a lot of time to play a 6-minute record. To your point, I remember a lot of promotional records. That these are the 45s that were handed out by the record companies directly to the radio stations for airplay. Some of them would have the edited version of a song on one side and the longer version on the other. Or, as you said, you'd have to refer to the LP to get the full-length version. Great example of that is Lion Eyes by the Eagles. There was an edited version of that went out to radio that was used more for AM stations. Margaritaville by Jimmy Buffett had an edited version, and the longer version was on the other side, or on the album. And to this day, when I hear that album cut, which is all you ever hear anymore, I think, wonder whatever happened to the edited version and wonder where that is. If somebody still has that master, unless you have the original 45. Again, things have just changed, but those were fascinating days, and they're fascinating to look back on. And when I talk about things like this, and I'm sure when you do too, people are just incredulous that it was once that way.
Yeah. Program directors and music directors, was that in your world when you first started in radio? I know that some DJs, it was kind of a free-for-all. They could play what they wanted, whenever they wanted, however they wanted. But then you had those formidable forces of a PD or an MD dictating things. Was it that way?
Well, my understanding is from the earliest days of radio, there was always a program director. But once radio had become primarily a music medium, as you said, a lot of DJs had great latitude over the shows they ran. That was pretty much the case when I started in radio. The disc jockeys still had a lot of latitude. However, if you worked on the staff of a radio station, at least it was this way at the stations I worked for, the program director was God. You know, you couldn't cross him. You had to do what he told you, and he instilled enough fear in you. And I say he because they were all men. There weren't any women PDs in those days. He instilled enough fear in you that you adhered to the station's policy, whatever it was. And he would, he would sit you down as a new employee and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is how the station needs to sound, and this is where we're headed. Now go do it, without telling you what to play or whatever. But this is what you need to adhere to. And if you got off the beaten path, outside of those boundaries he would set, whatever they were, you would hear about it the minute you got off the air or the next day. So we kind of knew our lane. We knew what we needed to do. It was only later. Oh, and music directors. Where there was a music director, it was just their job to interface with the record companies and make sure we had the music we needed. That was about all there was to that job. Later, though, and this came along, I started seeing it really in the mid-1980s when computers started being used to schedule things and so forth. And also when the value of radio stations started going up and the need for a more competitive advertising situation and so forth, and more targeted audiences and so forth, the music policy really got locked down on radio stations. So the disc jockey became just basically a guy who went in with a list of songs that was given to him, and you play this and you don't deviate from it, which is pretty much the state of radio today.
I want to back up a little bit, or quite a bit. In fact, when you started listening to radio, as you said, on your grandmother's tube radio set, you were listening to a station, I'm assuming, such as WSM, which is the official station of the Grand Ole Opry. It's been around forever. I remember my dad and I would travel. We'd be in Arizona or New Mexico late at night when the signal would boost, because stations would do that back then, and you could pick up WSM. And I always thought that was such a weird kind of a thing to happen.
Well, and people think what you just said is true, that the station actually increased its power after dark. That's actually a natural phenomenon. What happens with the group of frequencies, and some of my engineer friends might chide me for not explaining this well, but with the group of frequencies that AM radio operates in, there's an atmospheric effect that happens after dark. As the surface of the earth cools, the atmosphere actually raises, and the signals, they call them sky waves from radio stations, will bounce off the atmosphere in such a way that they can travel great distances after dark, which is why a system of daytime only and lowering power and all that went into effect. So you had certain stations that had won the right to be on at full power 24 hours a day, and that WSM was one of those. They were called the clear channels. And then the smaller stations had to go off the air at sunset and get out of the way, or either reduce their power or change the pattern of their signal, or both, to make the AM dial useful at night. Otherwise, there'd be so much interference that no one would be able to listen. So WSM was one of those, and it astonished me when I started working there about all the distant calls I would get and things like that.
And that's what I wanted to ask you. When you first started at WSM, did you have any idea that's where you were going to be? I mean, as a kid, you listened to the station.
That was it.
That was it.
There was no other goal in my life when I was young to do anything but to work at WSM and be on the Grand Ole Opry, which is part and parcel of the whole plan. And again, I don't know why that was. I do know this, and I'm going to write about this one of these days if I can find the words to do so. The WSM, I think, unlike any other station in America, was iconic to this area. From the time they went on the air through at least the 80s, if not longer, and those letters still have a mystique. WSM was the station that everyone turned to. You might listen to other stations. You might go over WSIX, the ABC affiliate, where you could get Paul Harvey, or you might listen to WLAC for the R&B and things they did at night, and for CBS programming. But WSM was so big in the minds of people here in this town. It's very difficult to explain to someone who isn't a native of here what that station meant culturally to Nashville. I mean, it built the music business single-handedly. There would be no music business in Nashville were it not for WSM. It's an absolutely amazing story, and I bought into that as a kid. I think what amazed me growing up, and again, I told you I was in love with the medium of radio, was how WSM seemed to be above all the other stations. And that wasn't a function of ratings or the audience size. It was more of a function of, we're going to do our own thing, and if you like it, great. If you don't, fine. And so there were all the other stations that competed fiercely for audience, and they did a great job. We had great radio here in Nashville, but then there was WSM that was above all of it. And I would listen to the station, and early in the morning they would have farm programming, and they would have live music. Lester Flatt had a daily live show of 15 minutes of bluegrass music. That's where I really fell in love with bluegrass and fell in love with him personally. Then later on, they had a live band show with a horns and vocalists and so forth that would sing. They would play for an hour in the studio every day. And then we had, you referenced Noontime Neighbors a while ago. That was the midday farm show, hosted by the same guy who did the other show. And then, they would have baseball games and football games, and they played classical music at night. And then overnight, they played country music with Ralph Emery and so forth, and the Grand Ole Opry on the weekends. It was like a feast for somebody who was interested in radio, because there were so many different kinds of programs. And it all fit together somehow, and people would listen to it and say, "Well, that's WSM. This is Nashville. This is what Nashville is represented on that station." So that's all I ever wanted to do. I had to be a part of that.
In the studio with us here today, a true radio legend sitting across the table from us, Kyle Cantrell.
This is David Frizzell, and you're listening to the business side of music.
You're listening to the business side of music.
As a musician, you have a dream, that vision of what success looks like for you. Though it's not only about the money, money is part of it. Whether you've been extremely successful or you're just striving to maintain a regular cash flow, you need a plan. Money Concepts can help you develop a customized plan to achieve the financial stability and success you want. For over 40 years, Money Concepts has been providing holistic financial planning services to individuals, families, and business owners. As an independent firm, Money Concepts and their associates are committed to always represent the best interest of the client. It's really about a committed, benevolent interest in them personally. This independence, coupled with that committed, benevolent interest, means they represent you, the client, not a product supplier. It's not about selling products, it's about helping you achieve success. To learn how this can benefit you, contact my buddy, John Adams, with Money Concepts at 737-867-9309. That's 737-867-9309. You can also email John at jadams@moneyconcepts.com.
Hey, this is Jack Sharkey, host of Between the Notes. Take a break from all the turmoil in the world and join us each week as we explore the magic, mystery, and beauty of music. Between the Notes, a podcast dedicated to everything music, available everywhere you get your podcasts.
You're listening to the business side of music.
Back in the studio here in Nashville, Tennessee, Kyle Cantrell is sitting across the proverbial and physical podcast table here in Music Dog Studios. Your years at WSM. Now, I'm a former touring guy and record label guy, and one of the big things we always attempted to do, we strive to do, was to get our artists into radio stations and on the air. We called them radio tours back in those days. I think they probably still call them that. Did you ever get tired of those new artists, those wannabes, those up-and-coming, freshman entertainers just wanting a little bit of microphone time in the booth with you?
Sometimes. There are two weaknesses I have. One is that I love radio and I have very definite ideas about how it should be done, which means that managers and program directors and people like that, I've been at odds with them many times. I'm very old school about some things, and I'm very up to date about other things. But second to that is a passion for country music, and that's a weakness. And when I say country music, the first country music I really heard and paid attention to and loved was Hank Williams, who had been dead for years before I discovered him. And that being my defining understanding of country music, it took me a long time before I could actually stomach anything that didn't sound like 1950s country music. So therefore, I have very definite ideas about what constitutes country music too. Now, I've grown with the times, and I really appreciate a lot of the modern artists, and did when I was working in radio. But as a program director at WSM, I was on the receiving end of a lot of those radio tours you were talking about, and I would kind of get a little impatient with some of these people coming in who, really had no clue. They didn't know, not that they needed to sound like some of their ancestors musically, but they needed to have some appreciation for what brought them there, and they didn't seem to have a clue. Well, some of them didn't. That's one of the things I loved about Randy Travis and Ricky Skaggs and George Strait and the like, because they really knew the heritage, but they had moved it forward. And those were artists that, I played a lot of in my days at WSM. Alan Jackson, even Garth Brooks. Those guys understood the music. Reba McEntire was another one in her early days particularly that I thought was the real deal. But then you'd have these others, and a lot of them you've never heard of because they didn't make it. But record labels were investing tons of money to try and launch them on these radio tours, and nothing would happen because there wasn't any kind of genuineness there.
No, I get it. In fact, I was road managing a band in the mid-'90s who did a 9-week radio tour. We started in Portland, Maine on Halloween, and we finished up somewhere on the West Coast in January, February, something like that, I guess it was. And you're right, we'd walk into some of these stations and they didn't have a clue about the heritage, the legacy, or the history of those stations. And of course, I don't think I can ever get tired of saying this. WSM was kind of the granddaddy of them all. You said it earlier, I believe. What your station did, what WSM did, really set the benchmark for everybody else.
Sure did, and I'm one of my proudest moments for the station, and not for me personally. I just happened to be there at the right time for this to happen. Was when Radio and Records, which was a big trade publication at the time, named WSM Radio Station of the Century, and I guess Country Station of the Century may have been the right title, or maybe it was Radio Station of the Century. I don't remember which, but that was so appropriate at the end of the 20th century to say that about WSM, because there are a lot of iconic stations around the country, but I can't think of one that had the cultural impact that WSM had. Maybe WLS in Chicago approaches that, maybe WSB in Atlanta, maybe a few scattered around, but WSM is in a league all its own. So I was very grateful that was conferred on the station, and was very proud to be a part of it at the time that happened.
You brought up a little earlier your love for bluegrass music. So here's a question I have for you.
Yep.
What came first, country or bluegrass?
For me? Country.
Yeah,
country. But let me amend that just a little bit by saying I didn't draw a distinction. It was all the same to me. It was all country music, because my first frame of reference for listening to country music was the Grand Ole Opry. And Bill Monroe, who started bluegrass music, was a Grand Ole Opry star, same as Ernest Tubb, and the same as Hank Williams, and the same as Kitty Wells, and all of those people, and they all had their own distinct sound. Bill Monroe's sound was his sound. Ernest Tubb's sound was his sound. Ray Price's sound was his sound. They were all different. And so when I came along as a kid in the 60s and became aware of the Opry, you know, I would hear Ernest Tubb or Roy Acuff, and then I would hear Bill Monroe, and it just all sort of fit together to me. Flatt and Scruggs were on the Opry in those days, and I would hear them. I'd see them on television, you know, and they would have on their TV show stars that weren't bluegrass stars as guests, and it all seemed one and the same to me.
Kind of morphed together.
Yeah. Now, to more precisely answer your question, though, I think definitely country was first, because, as I mentioned, Hank Williams was the first artist that I really wanted to delve into as an artist. But right on his heels, and part of it was because he was on the radio every day, was Lester Flatt. I'd seen Flatt and Scruggs on TV. I'd heard them on the Grand Ole Opry. I was 9 years old when they split up. And then Lester carried on. And so I would listen to his radio show and realize this is the guy I used to see on TV. And now here he is in this radio show, and I think it's so cool that he's on every day doing this show for Martha White Flower. And so I had a deep love for Lester and Flatt and Scruggs very early on in my musical consciousness. So, you know, maybe at the same time. I don't know if saying country was really first, but to me it was all the same.
Now, please correct me if I'm wrong. I believe I remember my introduction to Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs was on the Beverly Hillbillies.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And I thought, who in the heck are these guys? Are these actors? Is this a comedy duo or whatever? But that was the real deal, wasn't it?
Yeah, it sure was. They if they were actors, they weren't particularly good ones. But they were part of the fabric of it. I loved the story that Louise Scruggs used to tell Earl's wife, who was the manager of Flatt and Scruggs, that they were approached about doing the theme song for the Beverly Hillbillies, and she at first said, no. She said, we didn't, we really want to try and take this music to the next level, and here you are trying to, characterize us as a bunch of hillbillies and sitting on hay bales and wearing overalls and all that stuff. So she said they convinced her by sending her the pilot for the show without the music or with other people playing the music, so they could see what the show was about. And that's when they bought into the idea of recording the theme song for the show and then subsequently making appearances as part of it.
Wow. What a great story.
Yeah.
Bluegrass music led you to Sirius XM, Bluegrass Junction at that point?
Well, sort of. Changes in the business did. I might have worked at WSM the rest of my life had not things changed the way they did. And we started out today talking about how different radio used to be. And, WSM, it got caught up in the changing times and so forth. And it was hard for us to maintain the things that we wanted to do. And then there were, again, my very definite ideas about radio, and I'd gotten up pretty high in management at the station before I left, and so they had decided to make some changes there, and I and others of my colleagues were shown the door, and I'd worked there 21 years at that time, and I still have nothing but good things to say about it, and I fully understand why I left.
But let me interject here and say that really wasn't abnormal for radio business.
No, what's abnormal is working someplace for more than 20 years.
Right.
Because, most radio people are nomads. They go from town to town, and they'll do 2 or 3 years at a stretch and then move on, and that's more the norm. So, to say I'm blessed is an understatement, that I've been able to have, 2 or 3 places where I have been for long periods of time. So anyway, I knew things were sort of unraveling for me at WSM, and the management, God bless them, they were up front with me about it, and we talked about where things were headed. So I'm contemplating, okay, what am I going to do next? Still employed at WSM, when a friend of mine named Terry Hurd, who was programming the Bluegrass channel at the time at Sirius Satellite Radio, said, have you considered doing some freelance work for Sirius as a show host? And I said, no. How do I do that? And he put me in touch with the folks in New York before I knew it, I'd signed a contract to become a host on Sirius Satellite Radio. So,
And this is before Sirius and XM merged.
correct. And so when Sirius signed on in early February of or late January, whichever it was, of 2002, I was on the air as the morning host, not bluegrass, but country. I did morning drive on the Roadhouse channel, what became the Roadhouse channel. It didn't have that name yet, but I was playing classic country. I felt that was right in my wheelhouse. And so I was doing that. When I left WSM, I still continued to work at WSM. They knew about it. I asked permission, could I do this? And they said, sure, fine. And so when I left, I was working for Sirius. So I really wasn't unemployed, although I wasn't making as much at Sirius as I was at WSM. But so I went there, I left there and tried a syndicated radio show for a while, classic country again. Did very well in all aspects of that show except making money. So after a couple of years of the Sirius and syndication thing, and I also worked at WKDF here in Nashville as a part-time on-air host, after 2.5 years of that, I decided this is not good. I need insurance for my family, and everything's costing me a fortune. So I actually just shut it all down, turned over the syndicated show to my syndicator. I don't know what they ever did with it, and left Sirius. And I spent a year just working in the non-broadcast sector. Well, I was still doing my syndicated show for another year. I forgot that part. But I was working selling computers, of all things. Then a friend of mine called me one day and said, and this is a greatly condensed version of this story, and it's already too long, but a friend of mine called and said, I just got off the phone with this guy at XM Satellite Radio who said he wanted me to come program the Bluegrass channel, and I told him I didn't know anything about programming, but I knew a guy he needed to be talking to. And I said, okay, really, do tell. And he said, so you be expecting a call from this guy. And his name was Ray Knight. And Ray called me like the next day and said, well, I didn't even know you were out of work. He said, I would have called you long before now. And he said this was on I think a Thursday, maybe a Wednesday. But he said, can you meet me tomorrow, Friday afternoon, at the downtown Sheraton Hotel here in Nashville? I'm going to be coming through. My office is in Washington, D.C., but I'm going to be coming through. Let's sit down and talk. Bob, I've never had anything like this happen in my life. Probably will never have it happen again. But I went down there to the Sheraton, and we sat down in the little lounge there just off the lobby. And he started talking to me about what he needed, and what he needed was somebody to run their bluegrass channel. And I said, well, I've always loved bluegrass and worked with a lot of bluegrass stars, but I've never done a full-time format in bluegrass. And he said, that's okay. He said, well, you're going to do a whole lot better than what we've got now. I said, okay. By that afternoon, I had the job. I mean, by the time I walked out, it was about an hour and a half later, I was hired. Wow. So that's what I mean. I've never had anything like that happen before. But the job was programming Bluegrass Junction. It had that name. It was on XM Satellite Radio. I went up to Washington and got trained. We broadcast the IBMA Awards for the first time that year, just a few days later. Learned how all their systems worked and did all the company things, and it became readily apparent to me that I was going to be a staff of one. And I came back to Nashville. We had a little outpost here with 3 or 4 people who worked in the Nashville offices of XM Satellite Radio. We had a studio in the Country Music Hall of Fame, and we had some rented studio space on Music Row, and that's where we were based. And it was pretty much do whatever you want. In fact, I asked one day, when I was in Washington, I stopped Eric Logan, who was the head of all programming for XM Satellite Radio, big boss. And he and I had known each other for quite a while. And he welcomed me to the company. We just happened to pass each other in the hall. And he told me how glad he was that I was working there and all that. And I said, well, thank you. I'm very grateful. And I said, if you ever have anything you need me to do related to the Bluegrass channel, let me know. And he said, as long as I hear a fiddle and a banjo, I'm going to be happy.
Wow.
And so it was really a blank check. And so I really had to learn how to program that channel in the right balance and so forth. We started doing some live shows, bringing bands in the studio to perform. something I always wanted to do at WSM, but we never could quite get that worked out. And at XM, it was just easy. We had the facility there, we had the engineer, we had the all the things we needed, and so we did that. I started doing an interview show every week and really getting to know the artists and to understand the music better. And it was the word is joyful. I just loved that. I said to myself, I don't ever want to return to programming or working in mainstream country ever again. I mean, you could give me a classic country show and I'd love doing that, but bluegrass was for me where it was at. And then when we merged with Sirius in 2008, Sirius obviously still had its bluegrass channel, and they had a bigger staff and so forth. So fortunately, my managers decided that I would be the one to continue programming the channel, and we retained the name Bluegrass Junction. And I got to use the staff members that were part of the Sirius Bluegrass channel, who I already knew from my previous time there, Joey Black and Chris Jones and Ned Luberecki. We had a guy named Marty Fitzpatrick that worked with us. He was an XMer, and he was there for a short time. But it was great to have a few more people and to be able to do a few more things. And that has been my journey, starting in 2005 under XM until just a short time ago.
On the show with us today here in Nashville, Tennessee, country radio, bluegrass radio legend Kyle Cantrell.
Hi, this is Michelle Wright, and you're listening to The Business Side of Music.
You're listening to The Business Side of Music.
Whether you consider yourself a musician or not, music is all around us, and it affects our everyday lives. Whether it's background music influencing our shopping habits in a store, organ music adding the vibe to a baseball game, or a playlist convincing us to keep going on that last mile of a run. I'm Mindy Peterson, host of the podcast Enhance Life with Music, where we take a holistic look at music's benefits through the lens of science and medicine, entertainment, and business. You can find me and Enhance Life with Music at mpetersonmusic.com/podcast or wherever you get your audio.
When you have a Korg synth at your fingertips, the possibilities are endless. Be it digital, analog modeling, altered FM, wave sequencing, or the multi-engine synth, Korg gives you easy access to a variety of features to help you get the perfect sounds quickly. Whether you're a professional musician or just starting out, Korg truly has a synthesizer to help you express yourself. Visit Korg.com or your favorite Korg dealer to get your hands on one of their products to create new music always. Korg, the official sponsor of the Business Side of Music.
You're listening to The Business Side of Music.
Back in the studio here in Nashville, Tennessee, sitting across the table from me, Kyle Cantrell. Your journey from WSM to Sirius XM to what you're doing today has been quite a journey. But now you have a new thing called Banjo Radio. Let's talk about that.
Well, I mentioned I worked at WSM for 21 years. If you add up my Sirius and my XM time, I was at Sirius for about 20. So I'm hoping this will last 20 years. I may not be around to see it, but I'm hoping so. When I left Sirius XM, as I told you a while ago, I've become all in for bluegrass now. And you don't hang around it and be a part of it for 17 years as I have without just falling in love with it and its people. And unlike country music and other forms of music, the community that exists in bluegrass is like no other. It is not anything that you're going to find anywhere else. That's really one of the main attractions to me. And so I felt that, I don't want to retire yet. I'm probably old enough to hang it up and just look back on accomplishments, but I don't want to do that. I love this too much. So I thought, what can I do to engage with people? And I found that, if you reach out to them a little bit, you've got a pretty large following, at least I have. And that amazed me. For one thing, I didn't know that there were that many people that cared that I would be doing something else. And I thought, these people need a place to to come together, another alternative for listening to bluegrass. And so that's where the idea for Banjo Radio came about.
And what's it going to be? How's it designed?
It probably will end up sounding very much like Sirius XM's Bluegrass Junction, because that's all I know how to do.
Right.
But it's going to be whatever I can put into it. It's going to be mainstream bluegrass music, today's artists, as well as all of the great artists of the past. So people that I've mentioned already today, like Bill Monroe and Flatt and Scruggs, will very much have a presence on the station, but also the current artists, the big artists, the Rhonda Vincents of the world and people like that who are making great bluegrass today and who are thought of as the big current stars of bluegrass. They will have a place on the station too. It'll be an internet radio station. We're putting together the pieces and parts right now. This is a little bit slower process, Bob, than I've wanted it to be. It's one thing to be an on-air host, content creator, program director, lover of music, and it's another thing to be your own engineer, your own manager, your own sales department, your own everything, And so what I ultimately want is an online app, or a mobile app rather, that you can download and access the station very easily, in addition to being able to find it online. So on any connected device, you should be able to hear Banjo Radio and enjoy bluegrass music. I want it to be a free service. That's one of my challenges, because that means I got to come up with some way to pay for all this. And
right.
Licenses and things like that are very expensive. The royalties we have to pay and all of that, plus software licenses and all the infrastructure it takes to run a station. So, but I feel like if I can get the funding for it, people will come and listen. They will be there.
Is this something that is going to be live to feed, or are you going to be recording programs, or have you figured out that format yet?
A little of both.
Yeah.
A little of both. I do envision doing some live things on there. As I say, 40 years ago, everything was live, and that was the only way to do radio. So that's natural for me to do live shows. And if I can be on live and interact with people in real time, I love doing that. Out of necessity, because there's only one of me at this point. We'll have a lot of recorded programming on as well. And some of that has to be done because, to grab an interview with an artist, for instance, you kind of have to work on their schedule.
Right.
It's much easier, and you get a much better interview if you can sit down and record it and then play it back at a convenient time later, which is what I've always done, and that's great. I'm looking forward to doing that. In fact, I've already done a couple of interviews that will run on the station. I'm going to do another one next week. So, yeah, it'll be a mixture of everything, and perhaps in time, as we become more successful and I can actually afford to do so, we'll get some other hosts on that will host other parts of the day, so it won't be just all me. But this is a labor of love for me, and it is going to be very much me, because it's kind of my brainchild, and this will be hopefully the end, the last big thing I do. And maybe not, but if it is, I'm okay with that.
We've talked about radio's past, and now we're really taking kind of a peek behind the curtains of radio's future.
Yes.
Because we've gone from AM to FM to satellite to now internet-based radio, web-based radio. Do you see that being as successful as the others can? And let me kind of caveat that by saying, because we have so many distractions these days, we have so many other things to focus on, 500 channels of television or YouTube streaming or the plethora of subscription-based programming. Does internet radio, from your opinion, have a chance to get that foothold in the door?
I think so. In fact, I think it's the future of radio. I really do. Over satellite even, which satellite's still very robust, but it is expensive to launch and maintain satellites in space just for the sole purpose of delivering audio entertainment.
Because I don't think, and I could be wrong, correct me if I am, but I don't think Sirius XM's made money yet with those satellites.
Well, I wouldn't know about that for sure, but they've been a successful company,
right,
however you measure that. But yeah, it's a very expensive business, despite the convenience of having a satellite radio in your car and you just push a button and you hear the audio. But I think what we're experiencing, and you hit the nail on the head, there are so many choices today that folks don't even have to ever turn on a radio for anything. A local station, AM is all but dead as a medium. FM is not what it used to be. FM is where AM was at one time. And satellite radio is, it's not for everybody. And so what are you left with? You're left with streaming services like Spotify and Pandora. You're left with whoever else comes along, and there are a lot of internet radio stations out there. And as cars become more and more connected to the internet, it'll be easier and easier to get all kinds of different entertainment. So I would think a station like Banjo Radio is going to appeal to bluegrass fans, but it's not going to appeal to a mainstream audience, and I don't think anything will anymore. The days of full-service mainstream radio are long gone, and television is pretty much that way as well. Because of the 500 channels, as you say, everything is very specialized. So you don't ever have to watch things you don't want to watch. You go to the channel that has the stuff you want.
I agree. I think we've become so niche-driven. It's like podcasting.
Yeah.
There's 2-some-odd million podcast shows out there, but each and every one of them is a niche. And I think it's finding that audience, and especially I think with bluegrass and the notoriety of your voice. If anybody's ever listened to WSM or has listened to the Grand Ole Opry or has listened to Bluegrass Junction, they're going to recognize your voice. And I think that in itself is going to be a nice launch pad.
Well, that's something I can't take any credit for. That's something God gave me. But if I can do anything that would make people feel better about life, I think that's the goal really of entertainment, is to take you away from your troubles for a little while. Whether it's listening to a great song or watching a movie or whatever it might be, listening to a podcast. That's the goal. That's the goal of what we do. And you were talking about the future of all this. I think what we're doing right now is a huge part of the future. I'm amazed at how many people appreciate podcasts today that a generation ago would listen to the radio. And, I know you probably can relate to this because you and I are in somewhat the same age bracket. When we were kids, forget my love for radio, all kids listened to the radio. We'd come home from school, the first thing that would happen is the radio would go on. And we wanted to hear what they were saying about the latest rock and roll record or whatever. And we wanted to hear the latest and greatest. It was our connection to the world.
And we had our own favorite DJs. For me, It was either Doug DeRue or it was Chris Squires or Jazz McKay. It was any one of those guys, and so many. Robert W. Morgan in Los Angeles, and Chef Tom Wayman. Those were the folks that you programmed your push-button radio in the car or set your dial to in your room to listen to because you almost became friends with them.
Yeah, you knew when they were on. You knew who was there when you'd turn on your radio every day. You knew who was on in the morning. You knew who was on in the afternoon. Maybe not in the middle of the day because you're at school. Yeah, I can remember those voices myself. And again, there were the WSM voices I listened to, but then there were all the local rock and roll DJs that we had, and we had some really good ones. And it was quite the thing back in the 60s and 70s to hear those guys talking about the music, and they could sell records just by endorsing some artist, just by playing it on their show, and all of a sudden there'd be a run at the record store for kids running down to get the 45s or maybe the LPs.
It's a whole different world now.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. This has been an honor.
And they want to find Banjo Radio?
BanjoRadio.com. Simple as that. All one word, Banjo Radio. If you will go there, right now, and it of course depends on when they're viewing this. If you're watching this on an archival basis, hopefully this has happened long ago. But if you're more or less in real time, we're not up and running yet, but you will see a place where you can sign up to get the latest updates. We're crowdfunding right now, so if you'd like to donate, you can click the donate button, and help us on this journey. Doesn't matter your donation, large or small, every bit of it's appreciated. So check that out, and hopefully we'll be together once again with Banjo Radio shortly.
I'd love to get you back on the show.
Love to be here.
There's a lot more for us to talk about.
Always a pleasure.
The Business Side of Music is the creation of Tom Sabella and Tracy Snow and is produced by Bob Bender. The Business Side of Music is recorded at Music Dog Studios in Nashville, Tennessee. Production sound designed by Keith Stark. Voiceover and promo by Lisa Busan.